Alright, so in this lesson we're going to go into the life and philosophy of the English radical William Cobbett, whom was a journalist in the early 1800s, most famous for his publication of the Twopenny Trash. Today he's not really spoken about very much, other than in select circles of people specialised in the field of Britain during this period, but I personally believe that William Cobbett should be treated with the same reverence as Walter Lippmann and Walter Winchell are treated in the sphere of American journalism. So let's take a look at William Cobbett. His youth and opinions. William Cobbett was a famous writer and pamphleteer born to a family in Surrey. He was essentially a supporter of laissez-faire capitalism, believing in low taxes and better representation in Parliament by abolishing the rotten boroughs. He served as a soldier in his youth, and his breed of radicalism was pivotal to the passing of the 1832 Great Reform Act, which is a topic that we're going to do another series on, specifically about the 1832 Great Reform Act and the days of May, and the potential bank run on the Duke of Wellington's government and how it was spurred on by the 1828 Catholic Emancipation Act. So we're going to do a series on that, and then we're going to do a series on the 1867 Act and the 1884 Act, where we'll be taking a deeper look at the figures Disraeli and Gladstone. So look forward to that. So, he did not believe in Malthusian population theory, which was popular in his day. He instead believed improvements in agriculture could allow the land to support a rapidly growing population. Now, if you don't know, which is perfectly fine, Malthusianism is essentially economic/political philosophy espoused by a man called Thomas Malthus, whom proposes that the number of people in an area can sustain, there's like a set point. So it's fairly true to some extent, but he neglects the fact that innovation can allow a certain plot of land to sustain a greater number of individuals by, for example, better farming practices, or as we saw in recent years, GMOs making the yield of flesh from the crops more efficient. But anyway, if you want to know more about Malthusian theory, you'll need to go into it on your own, because it's more than I can explain briefly now. Or I can do another video on it. So, his father taught him how to read, because obviously he was not from a very wealthy background. So, fleeing to France and America. Cobbett fled to France in 1792 after he got in trouble for mocking the military in his book A Soldier's Friend, but he fled to America that same year due to the violence occurring in France at the period. Bearing in mind, 1792-1793 was when the Robespierre's reign of terror was going on in France, and the Jacobins were executing vast swaths of the clergy and nobility. So, during his time in America, William Cobbett sided with Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party because they were more friendly with Britain than Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans were, also known as Jeffersonian Republicans. It's an entire story you probably already know about Hamilton and Jefferson's disputes, but essentially Federalists supported the idea of a strong federal government, while the Democratic Republicans preferred the devolved state legislatures. So, however, Cobbett was arrested in 1797 for writing a libel against the Spanish king, but the grand jury threw out the bill against him. The British deemed Cobbett to be a patriot for defending the British government's interest in America. So essentially, while Cobbett was in America, he supported some of the actions of the British government. So there was like, oh, he's not really a radical, or subversive, he is a patriot to Britain. So, if you don't know, the picture at the back that I've included is just a load of Jacobin revolutionaries wearing their revolution caps. Their name eludes me. So, Cobbett's famous publications. He's most famous for his work writing in the Gazette, which was a newspaper, and other books such as those under his portrait. So we've got that over there. Rural Rides, one of the most famous of his books. He was able to inspire the populace to take up the cause of parliamentary reform at the time by producing his Twopenny Trust, which contained major articles in the Gazette in the pamphlet form as a means to avoid the Stamp Act, and thus working class people had access to political writings. So, to briefly explain that, the Stamp Act essentially was a tax on printed publications. So, if you're going to say print a small book, you would be taxed for each page in it, which would bring the price of the book up rapidly due to the increased cost. So by producing the pamphlets, Cobbett was able to avoid this tax, so he was able to sell the pamphlets for far cheaper than he would were they to be sold in the newspaper, hence why they were called the Twopenny Trust. So pamphlets that could be afforded by the working class, so they could get these radical ideas that they may not have access to if it were not for these cheap publications. And figures like Henry Hunt, whom we have already gone over, who essentially espoused these radical views for free in his open-air speeches. So Cobbett's return to Britain. He returned to Britain just after the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, and he brought the bones of Thomas Paine with him when he returned. He spent his later years writing radical papers and pamphlets, but he was charged with libel 3 times over those years. He also campaigned as an MP 5 times, but only won a seat once in 1832, the same year as the Great Reform Act under Earl Grey's Whig government. So, his role in the reform movement. Cobbett is historically perceived to be one of the great parliamentary reformers of the Industrial Revolution, and his writings are regarded to have prevented many of the riots taking place in the 1820s, as he stated in his Twopenny Trust that rioting hindered the campaign to achieve parliamentary reform by encouraging the government to pass repressive legislation that would only destroy the reform movement temporarily. So an example of that would be Lord Liverpool's 6 Acts, or the Acts passed in Pitt's Reign of Terror, if you believe it deserves that term, such as the Seditious Libels Act, or the treason, essentially the ones that prevented freedom of assembly for radicals. So, he played a considerable role in encouraging the 1832 Great Reform Act under Earl Grey, who was the Whig Prime Minister at the time, following the Duke of Wellington, who was a Tory. So, just a brief summary. Cobbett's famous works were Rural Rides, Cottage Economy, his papers that he published in the Gazette, and his papers published in the Political Register. And his core ideas, philosophically, were those of parliamentary reform, Thomas Painian liberalism, small-scale capitalism, more representative parliaments, low taxes, abolition of rotten boroughs, peaceful demonstrations, and anti-Malthusianism. So evidently he would have been a member of the Anti-Cornwall League were he around at the time. So, let's say that's that for William Cobbett. We will be going over John Stuart Mill at another time for the famous figures, as he played an integral role to the 1867 Act, and how women's suffrage was beginning to play a role, having been officially disenfranchised in 1832. But that's it. Goodbye.